My colleagues and I often are talking with employer partners about their hiring process and some of the real and artificial barriers for candidates with disabilities that can happen along the way. Through this work, we have identified tips and best practices to help remove or lessen the impact of these barriers. We are excited today to share some of these ideas we've compiled for you to think about as you take a closer look at your own company's hiring process. To help me share this information with you is OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist, Julie Wood. Julie, would you like to share with everyone about how your role supports businesses in today's presentation?
Thank you, Kelly, and hello to all of you who are joining us. We are glad to have you with us today. My name is Julie Wood, and as OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist, my primary role is to work directly with our employer partners when they have questions that relate to accessibility. And that can include quite a variety of topics like how to navigate Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or discussing the accessibility guidelines for the physical and digital environments. Or often I consult with employers to identify the general possibilities for reasonable accommodations in their specific workspaces. Through our collective efforts at OOD, we have heard from employers with questions about their hiring processes, such as how can we attract qualified candidates with disabilities? How do we make sure our job descriptions are inclusive? Employers have also asked what they can and cannot ask during an interview to identify whether an applicant is qualified without asking something that may not be permitted. And of course, with the question of whether something is accessible comes the question of how can we make it accessible and what are some common accommodations that may be needed. So today's presentation includes some best practices for answering these questions. And then we will conclude with some helpful information about how to effectively integrate new employees with disabilities into their new positions by making sure the onboarding process is accessible.
That sounds like a lot of great information. Before we share these best practices, I'd like to tell our attendees about the resources we have available for them. In addition to the PowerPoint slides, you have the Learner's Guide, which includes more information than what we will cover today, plus the resources we used to create the training. We have also created an inclusive hiring resource tool that addresses each phase of the hiring process we will be discussing today. You can access this resource through the employers page of the OOD website at www.ood.ohio.gov. You can also find this tool now in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. As a reminder, the information shared in these resources and during today's training is only for educational purposes and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful as you consider the accessibility of your hiring process. During today's presentation, please feel comfortable to post questions in the questions and answers area at any time. We will be stopping between main topics to answer your questions. And with that, let's begin. When we recruit and hire people with disabilities, we benefit by having employees with great talent and skills who bring to the organization an innovative way of thinking and problem solving. There is also a business case for hiring people with disabilities that can give you an edge over the competition. A report from EARN, which is the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability, shows those companies who employ people with disabilities generate higher revenues and have larger profit margins. So there are many reasons employers wish to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. Having a hiring process that is accessible and inclusive increases the likelihood of attracting qualified candidates with disabilities applying for your open positions, which helps ensure you are tapping into a valuable source of talent and are not missing out on qualified candidates. Julie, what are the main aspects of the hiring process we will be discussing today?
Kelly, to help employers tap into this valuable talent source, we have organized the hiring process into 3 phases: recruiting, pre and post offer, and onboarding. We will discuss these phases one at a time and share some best practices for each.
Great. Let's jump right into the recruitment phase because this is step one in attracting qualified applicants to apply for open positions. Julie, there are many things to think about in this phase.
Yes, there are, but I'd like to point out that some of the best practices are similar for each phase. We aren't always learning something new at each phase. We're just remembering to consider accessibility and inclusion with each step. In our discussion about recruitment, we will talk about job descriptions, advertising for jobs, contracting with a staffing agency, and the job application process. Kelly, when we were creating this presentation, you made a great point that even before these areas are considered, it's important to strengthen the culture of inclusion within a company. Can you share with us what that includes?
Certainly. One of the best ways your company can communicate an inclusive culture is to make sure your messaging reflects that culture. What I mean is, do the images on your website or in your marketing materials include pictures of people with disabilities? Are your marketing materials written with inclusive language? Are your hiring professionals trained on disability etiquette to help offset any unconscious biases they may have? When you give thought to this level of inclusion, it creates a foundation in your culture that really is inclusive, which makes it natural for inclusion to permeate into all your efforts in the workplace, including those in the hiring process. And this includes making sure that job descriptions are written in an inclusive way. Julie, why are job descriptions so important?
Kelly, one reason job descriptions are so important is because applicants rely on them as a screening tool to decide whether they're qualified for the job. A job description that is written well will attract qualified applicants, and that gives you a greater pool of applicants to consider for the job. This is why it's best to create a job description before actively recruiting and interviewing. We will discuss best practices for developing job descriptions, using inclusive language, and including a statement about accessibility.
I think that starting with an understanding of how to develop a job description makes sense. What all is included?
There are many online resources, but for best practices, I am referencing the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, and its online resource called Job Description Topics. This resource describes a three-step process for creating job descriptions. Step 1 is performing a job analysis. Step 2 is recording information. And step 3 is determining the required qualifications for the job.
A job analysis sounds interesting. What exactly is that?
The job analysis involves examining the work environment and the job, and then recording the results into a formal document, which is the job description. When you perform a job analysis, you begin with observing the work environment to determine things like how the employee will operate in the physical layout, and consider conditions such as temperatures, noise levels, and lighting. Then you focus on the workstation and the job's essential functions. And then you collect information about the productivity expectations, the position's level of responsibility, the physical and mental requirements of the job, and any required qualifications.
The job analysis sounds like a very important process in developing a job description. What guidelines are there for how a job description should be written?
Well, we said earlier that job descriptions are used by applicants to determine if they are qualified for the job. An applicant will rely on the description of the job's essential functions to make that decision. So how we describe the essential functions matters when we are intending to be inclusive and attract qualified applicants, including qualified applicants with disabilities. What this means is, once you have examined the work environment and the job tasks, you want to give thought to how you write the job description. The best way to describe a job task is to write in the present tense begin the sentence with an active verb, and describe the expected outcome of the task instead of how the work is customarily done. It's a simple concept that just takes a moment to consider how you are saying something. So let's discuss an example. If a task involves taking notes during meetings, we may immediately think this means notes must be written down. But writing is not the only way that notes can be taken. Notes can be typed or dictated with recording devices or through using speech-to-text software. So instead of stating the job task is to write down notes during meetings, instead state this in terms of the outcome, such as record notes during meetings. The words write and record are both active verbs, which are recommended to use. Both statements are written in the present tense. However, the second statement is written based on the outcome of the task and not on the customary way the task is performed. Replacing the word write with record makes this essential function inclusive because an interested applicant with a significant physical limitation with writing won't feel unqualified because of the requirement to write notes, but may feel qualified because of the ability to record notes in another way. So that's an example of how to write an essential function. Jan covers additional items in their three-step process that are important to include that we aren't going to cover today, but I do recommend you check their resource to learn more.
That example really shows the importance of creating statements about essential functions that focus on outcomes so we don't miss out on attracting qualified applicants. And you're right, once we know to apply this approach to writing these statements, it is simple. A job description also includes the qualifications required for the job. What is helpful to know to make sure these are written with inclusion in mind?
We all know what job qualifications are. These are things like required skills, experience, education, and licenses. It's fine to have a list of qualifications. It's just important to make sure they are required and not just indicative of the way things are customarily done. For example, let's talk about requiring a license for a job and whether that could exclude an otherwise qualified applicant with disabilities. There are times when having a license is required. I am an occupational therapist, and to be qualified to work as one in Ohio, I must have an occupational therapy license. So it's not exclusionary to require that license in the job description for an OT. However, let me share an example described in the JAN guidance about a licensure requirement that may not be inclusive. In this example, the job description states an essential function is to attend evening meetings throughout the community. And because of this, the employee is required to possess a driver's license. In this scenario, is having a driver's license a need or a convenience? An applicant with a disability that does not have a driver's license may be able to attend evening meetings throughout the community by other means than driving, such as using public transportation, a ride share, or attending the meeting through video conferencing. So this could be a scenario where a required qualification unintentionally screens out a qualified applicant from applying for the job.
That's great to highlight that job qualifications are certainly allowed, but it's important to make sure they are required. I have reviewed many job descriptions, and I know that certain terms and word choices can pose barriers. Can you share some ideas on how to write essential functions using inclusive language?
Absolutely, Kelly. Words help us to communicate and convey information. The words we choose can make a difference, and there are some best practices to guide us. First, there are some general tips that are helpful to consider with all written communications, not just job descriptions. And these include using plain language that is clear and concise, such as words with a single meaning. And you want to avoid using jargon, technical terms, and unnecessary words or phrases. When you are describing a job's essential functions, it's helpful to remember that certain words are more inclusive than others. The Learner's Guide includes a link to a chart from Pace University that shows examples of some common ways job tasks are described, and then offers suggestions for how to describe these tasks in a more inclusive way. For example, often a job description will specify how much time an employee spends sitting or standing to perform a task. If this is in fact the only way the job task can be performed, then it may be just fine to state the task in that way. However, sometimes what the job really requires is that the employee remains in a stationary position to perform the job task. For example, the job description for a hotel receptionist might state that standing for prolonged periods of time is required to check in guests. This is likely because a portion of the check-in counter is often at the standing height of a guest approaching the receptionist to check in. So while it's understandable that the employee may need to remain stationary to perform the job, it doesn't necessarily mean that a person has to stand, considering there are standing height ergonomic stools the employee could sit in to perform the job just as effectively.
It really is important to consider there is more than one way to perform a task and really focus on what the goal or the outcome is of the task. That's helpful. I think we've done a good job of sharing some ideas for how to make the job description itself inclusive. Is there anything else we should discuss?
Kelly, there is one more item I want to discuss, and in my opinion, it may be the most important tip I share in any presentation about accessibility and inclusion. In fact, if I had to pick one thing I hope everyone learns today, it's the importance of including an accessibility statement about reasonable accommodation in all your written materials, including job descriptions. We know the ADA requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees with disabilities. And we know that an applicant or an employee with a disability may need a reasonable accommodation to participate in the hiring process or to perform the job's essential functions. But just because we know this doesn't mean that it goes without saying. When you include an accessibility statement that is easy to find in your job descriptions, you send a message to qualified applicants that you are an inclusive employer and that you care about candidates with disabilities and what they may need to participate in the hiring process or to perform the job. When you send that message, you are more likely to attract qualified applicants with disabilities, which increases the number of qualified applicants to consider for the job. There is an example of an accessibility statement in the Learner's Guide.
That is for sure a great tip, and it sounds like that completes the best practices we have for job descriptions. What comes next in the hiring process?
Once the job description is complete and there is a job opening, the next step is to advertise and recruit for the job. First, it's important to recruit from sources that include applicants with disabilities. OOD can be a great source for this. Next, make sure the advertisement includes the job's essential functions because these help applicants to know whether they're qualified for the job. The job announcement itself should be accessible, and what I mean by this is job postings should be placed in locations that are physically accessible. If a phone number is included in the job posting, make sure to establish accessible telecommunications, such as a telephone relay service. Another example is to be ready to provide written information in alternative formats when it's requested. And make sure your online postings are accessible for applicants using screen reading software. The advertisement is another place to include your accessibility statement, so applicants know how to request an accommodation if one is needed to apply for the job. We also recommend you review your application forms and eliminate any questions that are related to a disability. For example, you may not ask an applicant if they have received treatment for certain conditions or whether an applicant has been hospitalized. And you may not ask if there are any health-related reasons the applicant may not be able to perform the job.
Those are great tips, and you can reach out to your OOD Business Relations Specialist with those job opportunities to refer qualified candidates with disabilities. Julie, what should employers consider if they are working with a staffing agency instead of handling the hiring process internally?
That's a great topic to mention. Both the employer and the staffing agency have a shared responsibility to follow the requirements of Title I of the ADA. Because of that, it's a best practice to inform or remind the staffing agency of this mutual obligation to comply with the ADA's requirements. And it's a good idea to talk with your legal team and make sure to include a provision in the contract that states the staffing agency will conduct its activities in compliance with the ADA and other non-discrimination legal requirements.
That sounds like a good tip. I think we are ready for the next step in the process. The job description is written and the job advertisements are posted. How do we make sure the application process is accessible?
The application process can present barriers to applying for a job. There are some ways to make the online process more accessible, and it's also helpful to know how to provide alternative ways to apply for a job. Let's first talk about the online application. The first tip is to consult people with disabilities in the design process because they are often the best source of ideas for how to make work environments, job tasks, and processes accessible for everyone. The next tip is to include the accessibility statement and make this easy to find on the application page. There are times an applicant will need to request an accommodation and you want that to be easy to do. Also, some online application systems have a field for applicants to check yes or no to indicate whether they have a driver's license. When an applicant checks no, the system will not permit them to continue in the process. In fact, the state of Ohio's online system used to work this way until an OOD employee pointed out the barrier it created for otherwise qualified applicants with disabilities. Since the driver's license was simply a way to verify identification, this requirement was removed, and now applicants can supply other forms of state-issued identification. In addition to these tips, you'll find ideas in the Learner's Guide for more technical ways to make the online application accessible, such as what to think of when designing pages, when to use alternative text and captioning, and to remember to make online documents accessible.
Sharing the example of how an online application system can unintentionally screen out qualified applicants that do not have a driver's license is very helpful. Another way that applicants can be automatically screened out is through applicant tracking systems that are used by hiring professionals to manage applications and prioritize qualified applicants. These systems may automatically screen out an applicant who has gaps in employment. Sometimes a gap in employment is due to a disability. One consideration to remove this barrier is to allow a person to explain the gap. Julie, it is common for applications to be completed online, but what are some things to keep in mind if the online process is not accessible or if an employer has an in-person application process?
Kelly, this is an example of why it's important to have an accessibility statement that is easy to find in the job posting and in the beginning of the online application process. because if the process is not accessible, the applicant will know how to request an accommodation. One idea is to permit the required information on the application to be submitted in another way, such as through email, fax, telephone, or mail. Another idea is to have printed versions available to pick up at an accessible location. The in-person application process can be made more accessible by being prepared to provide written materials in alternative formats, which can include large print or braille. You may be asked to provide a reader to read information to an applicant with a visual or learning disability, and you may be asked to provide a scribe to assist with completing forms for an applicant with a visual or cognitive disability.
Those are helpful ideas for making both the online and in-person application process accessible. It sounds like some of the tips could be implemented ahead of time, such as making online forms accessible or creating written documents in large print. And some of the other tips are good to know about in case a request is made, such as creating documents in Braille. With that, we have hit on the topics we wanted to cover for the recruitment phase and would like to pause to answer any questions that have come in.
Hi, Kelly. Hi, Julie. We do have several questions in the Q&A box. The first one is there a handout with sample inclusive language for job descriptions?
I could take that one, Stephanie. This is Julie. We have a resource that we found from Pace University that I referenced a few minutes ago, and we also included in the learner's guide. And it includes a chart that I think is pretty helpful. What it does is it gives you a list of the common ways that we describe essential functions, and then it gives you another column of ideas of ways that maybe we can describe jobs in more inclusive ways. The first example that comes to mind is that sometimes we might describe a job task as having to pick up or lift an item and carry it somewhere. And so the suggestion is maybe we re-say that in a more inclusive way that says we maneuver items and transport to another location, pointing out that maybe sometimes we don't need to carry something, we could put it on a cart and move it. So the Pace University chart is what I would recommend as a starting point for just finding words that might be more inclusive for job descriptions.
Great, thank you, Jolie. Next question is, what type of accessibility statement can or should you include if the job mandates several physical requirements?
This is Julie. I can take this one also. I think the accessibility statement is the same regardless of what the job requires, because the job will state in its description what those essential functions are that a person can read through. What's important is that the statement lets them know that there is a way to request an accommodation. We included one example in the learner's guide, but we also included a link to a resource from Jan that has several options, so you can read through a variety of examples of accessibility statements, so you can customize one that works best for your situation.
Great. Last question for this question and answer break. How do you know if a website is accessible in terms of screen reader, etc.?
This is Julie. I can take this one as well. That's a good question. In my role as the Worksite accessibility specialist, I have consulted with employers that have asked that question about how do we make our digital environments more accessible and more inclusive. And so in the research that we have done, we have collected some information on how you can test your website. Some of these tests are free. I don't know how comprehensive they are, but there is some testing you can do that's out there. And we also, in the learner's guide, included a reference for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a collection of international guidelines to help make the digital environment more accessible. The acronym for that is WCAG, and it's referred to as WCAG, that's how it's said. So if you've heard that, that's what that's referring to. That's a good starting point to understand what the accessibility guidelines are for that standard. What I would recommend too is if you're uploading any forms to your digital environment, to your website, before you upload them, for example, if you created a Word document, you can turn on the accessibility checker in Microsoft Word so that as you're creating a form, it will indicate whether or not it's accessible. And if it's not, it allows you to look through some suggestions that they have to troubleshoot how to fix the document and make it accessible. So that's another good place to start. I'm happy to talk with anybody offline too about how to connect with some of those testing resources and with the accessibility guidelines if that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Julie. We're ready to move on.
Thank you for your questions. Let's turn our focus now to the second section of inclusive hiring. Once a qualified applicant is identified, the pre-employment phase begins, which can include the interview, any testing that is required, checking references and backgrounds, making an offer, and administering post-offer medical questions and examinations. The pre-employment phase is divided into two stages, the pre-offer phase and the post-offer phase, and each comes with a specific set of guidelines. We will discuss these guidelines and share general ideas for what accommodations may be needed throughout the pre-employment phase. Julie, many employers have asked us what they can and can't ask in an interview to determine whether the applicant is qualified, but also so they are not asking something they shouldn't.
This is an important topic. The EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has published guidance for the pre-employment phase of hiring. This is a great resource to reference, and the website is included in the Learner's Guide. I'd like to discuss some of the main points it offers. First, you are permitted to obtain the information needed to determine if an applicant is qualified. You can do this by asking job-related questions, using non-medical tests, and obtaining medical information. What's important to remember is this. Before making a job offer, it is not permissible to ask disability-related questions or require medical exams. And this applies to application forms, interviews, testing, and background and reference checks. The reason for this is to prevent qualified applicants from being screened out due to a disability before their ability to perform the job is evaluated. So any information you need that is medical in nature, whether it's a question or a medical exam, must wait until after a conditional job offer is made. And these questions and exams must be required of all candidates that are offered the job in the same job category.
From a hiring perspective, what is considered a disability-related question and a medical exam?
A disability-related question is likely to elicit a response that discloses a disability. Some examples of these types of questions include asking about the severity of a disability, or asking about a major life activity, such as the ability to stand for 8 hours, or asking how many days an applicant was absent from work due to being sick. A medical exam is one that seeks out information about a health condition. For example, a vision test that is analyzed by an optometrist, or a blood pressure screening, or a nerve conduction test. You can administer a non-medical exam before a job offer is made, so I'd like to share an example of the difference between a non-medical exam and a medical exam. Let's say you want to assess the ability to perform an essential function of the job and conduct a test requiring the applicant to handle a 25-pound box and maneuver it 10 feet. This is not a medical exam. This simply evaluates whether the applicant can perform the task. If the same exam also includes taking the applicant's blood pressure or heart rate before or after performing the task, this is a medical exam because it measures a physiological response. If it's necessary to conduct the exam in this way, it needs to be completed after a job offer is made and be required of all candidates that receive a job offer in this job category.
Julie, what can an employer do then before making a conditional job offer to determine an applicant's qualifications without eliciting information about a disability or health condition?
This is where it's helpful to review the EEOC guidance because while I will discuss this from a general perspective, there are exceptions and the guidance explains those. In general, the kinds of questions you can ask before an offer is made include things like asking about non-medical qualifications and skills, such as education and work history, and whether the applicant has the required certifications for the job. You can ask about the applicant's ability to perform job tasks as long as the question is not phrased in terms of a disability. For example, you may describe the requirements of the job, such as moving 25-pound boxes that are stacked on skids to a cart that is 36 inches high, and ask the applicant if they can perform this task. You can ask all applicants to describe or demonstrate how they would perform job tasks with or without reasonable accommodation. Generally, this must apply to all applicants. However, if an applicant has a known disability and you reasonably believe the disability may interfere with or prevent the applicant from performing a task, the applicant may be asked to describe or demonstrate how this task would be performed, even if other applicants are not asked this question. For example, if an applicant has one arm and a task includes maneuvering bulky items from a cart to racks at various heights, you can ask the applicant to describe or demonstrate how he or she would perform this task with or without a reasonable accommodation. If the applicant states they could perform this task with a reasonable accommodation, you must either provide the accommodation for the applicant to demonstrate the task or allow the applicant to describe how they would perform the task with the accommodation.
Julie, what are some best practices or tips that employers can use to make sure any pre-employment activities they use in their hiring process are free of disability-related inquiries or medical exams before making a job offer?
Kelly, let's start with discussing the interview. It can be helpful to provide training and written guidelines for those professionals who interview applicants, so they are familiar with any legal requirements, such as the ADA, and are aware of the guidelines about disability-related questions. Another best practice for the interviewer is to remember to focus questions on the applicant's ability to perform the job, not on the disability. Knowing what questions to ask makes this easier to do, and it may be helpful to have these questions written down. For example, you may ask if the applicant is able to meet the attendance requirements of the job. You may ask if the applicant can perform the essential functions with or without an accommodation. And if the applicant indicates they can perform these with an accommodation, you may ask how they would perform the task and with what accommodation. It can also be beneficial to provide disability awareness training for interviewers. Kelly, I know you provide this kind of training for employers. Can you tell us about that and how it's helpful for those who conduct interviews?
Yes, my colleagues and I provide disability awareness and etiquette training for our employer partners. And part of this training includes helping hiring professionals understand some of the behaviors that may be present when interviewing a candidate with a disability. For example, a person with autism may not make eye contact, or a person may have a flat affect as a side effect of certain medications. In both cases, the applicant may be qualified for the job. Understanding these types of behaviors can help interviewers avoid unconscious bias.
Thank you, Kelly. That is certainly a great resource for employers. Now, once you identify the applicants you want to interview, make sure to include your accessibility statement in your invitation for the interview. This can help to prevent surprises on the day of the interview, such as an applicant with a disability arriving and needing an accommodation without you knowing ahead of time, which leaves you either scrambling to figure one out or rescheduling the interview. It can be helpful to be aware of general reasonable accommodations that may be needed for the interview, such as conducting the interview in a location that is physically accessible, and being prepared to provide a sign language interpreter. Also, an accommodation may include asking questions using direct and plain language that is free of jargon or technical terms, and then giving the candidate time to process the question before answering. And as we've mentioned before, be prepared to provide written materials in alternative ways, such as large print or in audio format. Kelly, you have noticed with the COVID-19 pandemic that although some employers were conducting interviews virtually before, many more are now. What do you think is important to know to make sure the virtual interview is accessible?
Julie, you are correct. More employers are conducting interviews virtually due to the pandemic. So I think it may be helpful to point out some of the ways these can be made more accessible for applicants with disabilities. Just as we've mentioned before, it's helpful to be prepared to provide reasonable accommodations and remember to include the accessibility statement with the invitation for the virtual interview. Pre-recorded videos with the time limits can present challenges with certain disabilities, and so an accommodation to consider is to provide an applicant with a disability more time to view the video. Some organizations perform video interviews that use a computer algorithm to assess facial movements. Certain health conditions can cause a person to have a flat affect. Because of this, assessing facial movements can create a barrier for applicants with disabilities, so you may be asked for an alternate way to interview. One aspect of virtual interviewing you can check into ahead of time is whether your virtual interviewing platform is screen reader accessible. If it's not, you may want to explore different platforms that are accessible, so you are prepared if a request comes in. Also, if during the interview there are links or graphics to click, make sure they are also accessible for screen readers. It's also a good idea to know if your interview platform supports a third-party participant when an American Sign Language or ASL interpreter is needed. If your platform does not support a third-party participant, identify options such as Zoom that may be suitable for all three parties. Many interviews are conducted using a panel of multiple people, which can present challenges for applicants using an ASL interpreter or captioning. We recommend you work with the applicant ahead of time to let them know there will be multiple people conducting the interview and discuss with them appropriate solutions that meet both of your needs. In the event an applicant requests an ASL interpreter, know ahead of time who your company uses for interpreting services. In other words, is it a local provider or a national service? This can make a difference in the smoothness of the interpreting. This is a tip that can be beneficial for the in-person interview and the onboarding process as well. Captioning may be an appropriate reasonable accommodation, but do not rely on the automatic captioning that comes with some platforms. The automatic captioning uses artificial intelligence, which can make misstatements and lacks punctuation, which can be confusing. Professional live captioning would be a better option, and OOD can link you to that.
Kelly, those are great tips to consider for the virtual interview environment. There are also important considerations for exams given during the interview process. As I mentioned earlier, you may administer non-medical exams to determine an applicant's qualifications. One best practice is to inform the applicant of the details of any required testing in your invitation for the interview. This information, along with the accessibility statement, will help the applicant to decide if an accommodation is needed and inform them of how to request one. Some of the general reasonable accommodations that may be needed for testing include conducting a written test in an alternative format, such as large print or through an electronic version on a computer, or delivered in an oral format. Another accommodation may be to permit extra time to complete a test, or to use plain language in testing materials. And you may receive a request to permit the applicant to take the test in a separate room away from distractions.
Julie, is there anything special for employers to know about conducting background checks and reference checks?
Kelly, there is, and really it's just important to remember that in the pre-offer phase, you may not request information about an applicant from another source that you are not permitted to request of the applicant. This includes asking about things like disability, illness, and workers' compensation history. So it's a best practice to check with any outside agencies you contract with to make sure the agency complies with legal requirements, such as the ADA, regarding pre-employment inquiries.
That is all very good information, and I think it will be helpful for employers. Let's transition now from the pre-offer phase to the post-offer phase of pre-employment. What is important for employers to know about this phase?
Once a formal job offer is extended, you may ask disability-related questions and conduct medical exams. Again, the important part to remember is that these types of questions and exams must apply to all candidates that receive a job offer in the same job category. The job offer is permitted to be conditioned on the results of the questions and exams. Also, when you ask disability-related questions or conduct medical exams, remember to keep the medical information you obtain confidential and follow the EEOC guidance for this.
Julie, I know this is a training about inclusive hiring, but is there anything that changes about being able to ask disability-related questions or require medical exams once a candidate accepts an offer and becomes an employee?
The rules do change again here. Once a candidate is hired and becomes an employee, generally, you can no longer ask disability-related questions or require medical exams. The EEOC guidance addresses some exceptions to this, such as when an employee requests an accommodation or when you reasonably believe safety is a concern. This applies to all employees, not just employees with disabilities.
Julie, is there anything unique about the questions an employer can ask and the medical exams they can administer with the current COVID-19 pandemic we are all facing?
Kelly, there are a few things I'd like to highlight. The EEOC has a resource titled Pandemic Preparedness that has been updated for COVID-19. And as the pandemic evolves, it's further updated. It addresses the pandemic's impact on the hiring process and things like screening applicants for symptoms and taking temperatures. These are considered medical exams, and that means if they are administered, they should be included in the post-offer phase, which means a job offer has been extended, and they must apply to all candidates receiving the job offer in the same job category. There are additional aspects of the hiring process the guidance addresses, and we certainly encourage you to review the information and check for updates. We have included the website for the EEOC resource in the Learner's Guide, along with the websites for the Centers for Disease Control and the Ohio Department of Health for additional resources on COVID-19.
Thank you, Julie. That brings us to the end of the pre-employment phase of the hiring process. I know we covered a lot of great information. Let's check to see what questions have come in.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Kelly. We do have several questions. The first question, for physical requirements, I've seen something along the lines of 20/40 vision in each eye with or without correction is required. Is there a better way to make this more inclusive?
That's a good question. This is Julie. I can take that. Deciding some of these things is very case by case, and I feel like I would need a little bit more information about what the essential functions of the job are that are requiring that vision, because it could be absolutely that's a requirement, and whether or not there is a more inclusive way of saying that would allow for an accommodation to kind of fill that gap if somebody doesn't have that level of vision, is something that, again, I would need to see the work environment and know a little bit more about that task to know if we could write that in a more inclusive way. There was a second resource that we included in the Learner's Guide and discuss in the information, and it's from HR Guide, and it includes how you write essential function statements. They refer to them as duty statements, but it's the same thing. And in there, they make a list of all the different types of requirements: physical requirements, mental requirements, vision, and they do offer different words. And so that might be another resource to look at to see if they offer some terminology that would help to phrase that, if you feel that it would be more inclusive to phrase it in a different way.
Great, thanks for that response. Next question. If an employee refuses to complete a task but does not request a reasonable accommodation or disclose a disability, can the employer discipline the employee for refusing to complete the task?
This is Julie. I can take that one as well. So all employees are expected to meet your level of productivity and performance expectations, and so you would address that situation the same for all employees. And in that conversation where you're talking about what the employee is refusing to do, if the employee does not disclose a disability and request an accommodation, then you would not know that they have a disability to offer an accommodation, and you are advised to keep your conversation on the performance, and you are able to follow your performance, the word is failing me, whatever your consequences are, you're allowed to administer those. So it's when a person says that they have a difficulty doing a essential function and they relate it to a medical condition that you have then entered what is called the interactive process, because that is a request for an accommodation, and that's when you would begin to explore that further. But if there's no mention of a medical condition and there's no request for an accommodation, then the general guidance is that you follow your performance consequences as you would with all employees.
Okay, thanks for that response. Next question. How can an employer verify that a candidate who has requested an accommodation is truly covered under the ADA?
This is Julie. I can take that one as well. So when an employee requests an accommodation and you're in that interactive process, if the disability or the need for accommodation are not obvious, then you are allowed to ask questions or request medical documentation to verify that the disability exists. And so there's guidance I could share with you if you want to send me an email to get you right to that in the EEOC guidance about, what kind of questions you can ask and what level of documentation you can request, because the documentation itself has to be reasonable. We can't ask for an entire medical file, but you can ask for what you need to verify the disability does exist.
Okay, thank you. We can continue moving on with the presentation at this time. We'll finish up with the remaining questions during the next Q&A break. Thanks.
Those were great questions. Thank you. We'd now like to share some best practices for the onboarding process. We all know the purpose of onboarding is to smoothly integrate newly hired employees into their positions and the culture of the company. To ensure this is successful, for employees with disabilities, Julie has some ideas to share with us.
Thanks, Kelly. There are two topics I would like to address with onboarding, and that is the onboarding process itself and the types of accommodations that may be needed. Let's start with the process. First, and I know I might sound like a broken record, but we want to make sure the information delivered to new employees about onboarding includes an accessibility statement. The invitation should describe the activities included during onboarding and training, the components of the work environment, and detailed information about the job and the workstation. When you inform the new employee with this level of detail, it enables an employee with a disability to determine if an accommodation is needed. Including the accessibility statement informs the employee of how to request one. Next, you may find it effective to assign an employee to oversee any requests that are made for accommodations to ensure the request is facilitated efficiently and that accommodations are in place for the first day of work. It can also be helpful to provide training for the employees that facilitate accommodations in your work environment for things like parking and facilities, information technology, security, and the workstation. And this education should address the requirement of confidentiality and how to respond to questions asked by coworkers.
That's great advice. What kind of accommodation requests might an employer find new employees are requesting for onboarding?
Well, we know that reasonable accommodations are considered on a case-by-case basis, and that not all employees with disabilities need accommodations. But when an accommodation is needed, it's helpful to be familiar with some general types of accommodations. For example, it's important to make sure any new hire forms to be completed during onboarding are accessible or can be made available in alternative formats. We also want to consider whether the company's intranet will be accessed during onboarding and make sure it's accessible or that we can provide alternative ways for the information to be accessed. Another accommodation is to provide a sign language interpreter when needed, and it may be helpful to research service providers in your area before a request is made. We've talked about this during the other phases of the hiring process, and it applies here as well. And that is to be prepared to provide written information in alternative formats, such as large print, braille, or an electronic version. You may be asked to permit the use of service animals, and when this is the case, you'll want to consider relief areas. And as mentioned before, onboarding should be conducted in a location that is physically accessible. You may be asked to provide a reader to read written materials to the employee, or you may be asked to provide a scribe to assist with completing forms or taking notes. And when you're addressing emergency situations and safety procedures, make sure to include an accessibility statement so new employees know they can request accommodations for things like emergency evacuation and shelter-in-place needs.
Those are great accommodation ideas, and it's helpful to see that some of the same accommodations are mentioned in the various phases of the hiring process. I can see where being familiar with some of these general accommodations may make it easier to weave them into the hiring process. Before we conclude our presentation, let's pause one final time for questions.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Kelly. We do have several questions. First question, for a written guideline for interviewers, is this a standard or is there a variance based on the type of company? How can that be attained?
This is Julie. I can take that. There isn't a standard. You as the employer can customize your questions, and the EEOC just offers this great guidance to help employers navigate what you can do before you make a job offer and what you can do after you make a job offer to prevent discrimination based on disability in the hiring process. And so with the best practices we've shared and with their guidance, hopefully that helps you to be able to craft the questions that are best for you to be able to identify if the applicants you're interviewing are qualified to do the job. Kelly, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, Julie, I think you covered that well. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Could you please provide some sample legally permissible interview questions related to attendance or provide resources where this could be found?
This is Julie. In the resources or the reference section of the Learner's Guide, you will find several guidances published by the EEOC. I tried to organize those so you can get to the category that makes sense for your question. But there is a guidance on the pre-employment process, and they give a lot of examples. You know, when they say this is when they talk about don't ask disability related questions in the pre-offer phase, they give a lot of examples of what is a disability related question, and then they do give some examples of how you can ask things. And so while, for example, you can't ask about somebody's attendance due to illness, you can ask if a person can meet the attendance requirements of the job. And so that guidance is helpful in helping to navigate those tricky ways to ask these questions to get to what we really want to know and what we are allowed to ask. And if I can help anybody get to that quicker than trying to figure out which resource it is and then exactly where in the resource you can find it, please reach out to me.
Thank you, Julie. Next question. I have a candidate coming in to complete her new hire paperwork. She disclosed that she has a disability and wants to provide documentation. Is this something we should take to HR to include in the employee file? She did not tell me her actual disability and I did not ask.
This is Julie. I can take that one as well. So there's two things I would recommend with that. First, I would ask your HR team how that documentation is to be handled, meaning who is supposed to receive that information. The EEOC does have guidance on confidentiality, and all the information that you obtain that is in reference to an accommodation, a disability, or a medical condition is supposed to be kept separate from regular personnel files. So where you store that information, if it's electronic or in a physical filing cabinet, it needs to be separate from your regular personnel files. And that's because in some organizations, maybe some people in HR have access or permission or authority to access that information and others don't. And so again, I could help point you to the confidentiality criteria if that is helpful.
Thank you, Julie. Next question. In terms of service animals, are we able to differentiate between service, therapy, and comfort? Are we permitted to differentiate between, sorry, that was repeated, and to ask for certifications of such?
So there is guidance on service animals, and to my knowledge, there is no certification for the animal that you can request. So again, you can ask for documentation to verify a disability exists. And I think what would be helpful is to maybe have an offline conversation about that so I can direct you right to the guidance on service animals to help better answer those questions.
Thanks, Julie. Next question. You've mentioned we may need to provide a screen reader if the employee has a Windows laptop. Is the Windows narrator sufficient?
This is Julie. There are a variety of screen readers. NVDA is a free one online. You may have heard of JAWS, that's a very popular one. Yes, Narrator is available. And so as far as checking whether or not your documents are accessible for a screen reader, you could test it through what you have available. So whether that's the accessibility checker in Microsoft Word, or one of the ones that I mentioned would be fine. If somebody is requesting as an accommodation to be able to use a screen reader to perform an essential function, then that would require your assessment with the employee to determine which one best fits their needs to be able to perform the essential functions.
Thank you, Julie. I believe this is our last question. Would convicted felons be considered employees with disabilities?
This is Julie. I would want to defer to the guidance on that, but to my knowledge, that is not a medical condition, and so I would want to double check this, but I do not believe that that would be classified as a disability according to the ADA.
Julie, this is Kelly. I can add something to that. A felony in and of itself does not count as a disability, but there could be disability-related issues that have led to some of the felony potential for the person. So a felony in and of itself or a convicted felon does not count as a disability, just isolated based on the felony alone.
Great. Thank you, Julie and Kelly. That is all of our questions for now.
Great. Thank you for those questions and for your interest in today's topic. We are nearing the end of our time, so I'd like to touch on a few closing thoughts. We discussed many best practices for inclusive hiring, and I hope you are inspired by the commonality of the accessibility components that are a part of the process. Many of the general ideas we shared for accommodations were similar in each phase, like making sure your job postings are in places that are accessible for people with disabilities, just as you want to make sure the locations where you conduct your interviews and onboarding are accessible. Also, we mentioned a few times that written materials can be provided in alternative formats, such as large print or electronic versions, whether it's for the job posting or the application or those documents distributed at onboarding. And we know the importance of including an accessibility statement that is easy to find in all of your communications, so that at any point along the way in the hiring process, a person with a disability knows how to make a request for an accommodation. This not only informs you of what applicants need, but prevents any surprises on the day of an interview or the first day of work. The accessibility statement also sends the message to the applicant that you are an employer who cares about what they need and about having an inclusive culture. We hope the information we've shared helps to elevate your hiring process to the next level, so you are accessing a greater pool of candidates, including candidates with disabilities. I appreciate you being with us today, and Kelly, I enjoyed co-presenting with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, please remember to submit the training evaluation to give us feedback and to receive HRCI credit. We will be posting a recording of today's presentation and will forward that link to you at a later time. And I'd also like to announce that our next virtual training is Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process, and it is scheduled for September 17th. So please be on the lookout for that announcement. We'd love to have you join us again for that training. And with that, this concludes today's presentation. Thank you.